Welcome, everyone. Oh, sorry. Oh, my goodness. Whoa. I think I just blew that thing out. Welcome. If everyone would be seated and tamp down your big feelings, big ideas for just a little bit here. Back off. Okay, I will. Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce President Michael Ann Williams for your erudition and inspiration, as in just moments away, she brings us her presidential address, After the Revolution, Folklore, History, and the Future of Our Discipline. All presidents of our society are charged with both leadership and stewardship. As a society, we are of many minds, but only one heart. And Michael Ann has steadily appealed to the importance of our unity. I know I thank her on behalf of the entire AFS membership for her willingness to serve and her admirable accomplishments in doing so. She's a native of suburban Bethesda Chevy Chase, which despite its uber suburban legacy has produced numerous folklorists, including Henry Glassy and Erica Brady. Now, Erica and Michael Ann cornered the market on redheaded folklorists from there. I guess Henry cornered the market on the mustachioed. Michael Ann received her PhD in folklore and folklife from the University of Pennsylvania. Her BA was in anthropology from Franklin and Marshall College, and she worked as a museum curator, historic preservationist, and public folklorist for a number of years before settling into an academic career. In January of 2016, she completes 30 years at Western Kentucky, where she has headed the Department of Folk Studies and Anthropology for 10 years, ever since its creation as a separate department, an achievement she spearheaded. Not surprisingly, Dr. Williams is a university distinguished professor, and she holds the unique position of being the first AFS president from Kentucky since Herb Halbert served in the mid-1950s. Michael Ann's books include Home Place, The Social Use and Meaning of the Folk Dwelling in Southwestern North Carolina, which won the Vernacular Architecture Forum's Cummings Award. She also authored Great Smoky Mountains Folklife, and another book called Staging Tradition, John Lair and Sarah Gertrude Knott. Michael Ann has been and continues to be a tireless advocate for the importance of studying and preserving folk and vernacular architecture. I count over 25 published articles in her CV that reflect her commitment to the folk home place, whether that be her early work in the 80s on the single-pen dwelling, or unlocking the grammar and codes of vernacular architecture in the 90s, or more recently attending to the economics of the boarding house. She's focused her work on the meaning and architecture of home and how fitting that is to what we admire and cherish about her as our president, helping the society retain and beautify its own folklore home. Now, as far as I know, our rent is paid up, but it's always due. There's never a time when we are not asked to give another dime of our abilities, skills, knowledge, or desires to keep that house of folklore built and strong. But thankfully, we have people such as Michael Ann on the deed to our legacy. And her part is no more importantly played, perhaps, than as she herself says about her favorite job as a leader in our field. And I quote, Michael Ann has said, "The very best thing about my career has been creating new folklorists." And I'd love for her students who are in the room to stand and be acknowledged. I know they're yes. That's fabulous. That's a body of evidence there. Her students would, I'm sure, attest to both the rigor and the fun she requires in teaching them. A midterm exam evidently includes a section called Folklore Trivia, a section largely devoted to the intimate histories of folklorists. Do you know who Kittredge's dog's name was? Beowulf. The winner of this trivia contest is presented with a crown and serenaded with the Anthem to the Trivia Queen. Latest winner, the lovely Sydney Varajan, who I think is seated right over here. Enough said, except Michael Ann is a proud Kentucky colonel, nominated by her students just in time for the Louisville AFS meeting in 2008. And she is an expert ballroom dancer. I know we're not having our traditional party tonight, but in spirit, we can sign up on Michael Ann's dance card for a spin around the dance floor of our hopes and dreams for folklore. Surely she has led and will continue to lead us well. Toes will not be stepped upon. Now on to Michael Ann's claims for the folklore revolution, a call to reclaim aspects of the folklife studies movement, especially the broad range of what we study and the integration of historical and ethnographic perspectives, and to deconstruct our deconstructions of the history of our field, and of course, as she says, to stop whining and engage in civil discourse. I give you and am pleased to ask you to give raucous, thankful applause to Michael Ann Williams.
I don't even know how Kay got some of that information. But thank you all. A few nights ago, my colleague Erica Brady delivered the first Don Yoder Memorial Lecture. And I also want to dedicate this address to the memory of Don Yoder, who was my dissertation advisor. One of the things that I admired the most about Don Yoder was the evident pride that he took in his former students' work. To my mind, this is the greatest pleasure of being a teacher. And although I have many decades to go before I have the perspective that Don Yoder had, I would like to take the time before I start to tell all of my former students how proud I am of them. I have to admit to being rather astonished to be in front of you. I've always fancied myself an accidental folklorist. Perhaps most of you are too. I entered a program in folklore and folklife having never taken a folklore class, and I'm ashamed to admit having ever read a serious work of folklore scholarship. Truthfully, the traditional stuff of folklore study did not attract me to the field. I attended a small liberal arts college in central Pennsylvania, coincidentally also Don Yoder's alma mater. He claimed for Franklin and Marshall College the distinction of creating in 1948 the first department of American folklore in the United States. By the time I attended, not a remnant of this curriculum remained, and I continued to be ignorant of the academic field. Instead, I drifted into anthropology. Although I loved being an anthropology major, my interest always seemed to fall betwixt and between. The pastness of archaeology just seemed too past. Cultural anthropology at the time seemed very little interested in the past at all. Luckily, I was assigned a work-study job at a college museum, and that experience ultimately led to a full-time job as a curator in another museum. Only through a series of chance encounters did I subsequently discover that there was such a field as folklore, and perhaps, like many of you, once I found it, it felt like home. The backgrounds and interests of my new classmates were quite diverse, but we all entered the discipline on the heels of a major revolution, or perhaps a series of revolutions, that radically changed the composition of the field. Gradually, it dawned on me that had I been searching for a field of study 15 years earlier, I would not have become a folklorist. I suspect that many of my generation who entered folklore in the mid to late 1970s felt like we had missed all the excitement. We had not been there to storm the ramparts. As authors and filmmakers have noted, living a revolution in the making is far more exciting than dealing with its after effects. However, for most revolutions, there is a time of brief florescence before new orthodoxies harden, a time when all things seem possible. Of course, Delheims once suggested we can traditionalize even a particular time and place of graduate study. But in retrospect, the period directly following the revolution of the new folkloristics seemed to be one of promise and optimism in the field. And just as a side note, nothing has brought me back to the feeling of being in graduate school again as hearing John Swed speak last night. From our current perspective, it is easy to remember the new folkloristics as a period of performance studies, a new contextualism, a greater emphasis on the ethnographic method, things that all made sense to a former anthropology major. Although often treated as a totally separate phenomenon, it was also an important time for the maturation of public folklore. Folklife studies, if noted at all, is often treated as an odd and perhaps quaint sidebar to that history. While Don Yoder's use of the term folklife to refer to a holistic approach which encompassed traditional folklore within a broader scope of study was not fully embraced by the academic discipline, though the term itself is now commonplace in public folklore, the movement, as Yoder characterized it, did much to push forward the acceptance of material culture and belief studies as an essential part of our discipline, as well as encouraging specific areas of study such as foodways and vernacular architecture. Like most revolutions, the new folkloristics contained inherent contradictions. Many, while still focusing on the oral components of expressive culture, sought to break away from the backward-facing orientation of the discipline. Folklore was emergent, dynamic. Tradition was constantly being reinvented. We could think of it as a verb to traditionalize. However, despite the seeming anti-historical thrust of the new folkloristics, the 1960s and 70s also brought us new ways to engage history. Our understanding of how individuals and communities construct their own histories, and the growing acceptance in folklore of the study of personal experience narratives gave us special insight into the emerging endeavor of oral history. Similarly, dreaming of more democratic histories, material culture scholars within our discipline used artifactual studies as a way to counter the elitist bias of document-driven understandings of the past. Of course, in these new historical perspectives, we were accompanied by changes in other fields, including anthropology, cultural and historical geography, and of course, history itself. Although I was redefining myself as a folklorist, in graduate school I took seminars on revitalization movements and ethnohistory from Anthony Wallace in the anthropology department, and historical archaeology and material culture studies and American studies. All these courses, along with those that I took within the Department of Folklore and Folklife, defined the work I chose to do. If there were inherent contradictions between the anti-historical thrust of performance studies and the growing involvement of folklore in oral history and artifactual analysis, I didn't feel it at the time. By the early 1980s, ambitious works promised holistic integrations within folklore for ethnography and history. What has happened to the promise of that era? The hopes of expanding not just our methodologies, but the scopes of the genres we study. The promise of integrating historical and ethnographic study. Was it diverted? Most importantly, what is its future? Had I been a generation older, as I said, I doubt I would have become a folklorist. The harder question is, would I become one now? Would I still be able to stumble into a doctoral program and be told, yes, of course your interests are folklore? I don't wish to imply that within our ranks we don't have many members who engage in material culture and historical research. In the past couple of years, we've witnessed the publication of books that sum up decades worth of research by individual folklorists engaged in material culture studies. AFS's two most recent working groups have been concerned with museums and historic preservation. We have a number of folklorists actively engaged in the museum world, including museum directors, and folklorists have been making important contributions to historic preservation. My concern is less with my generational cohort and what we're doing as what our next generation will be trained to do. My own subspecialty is vernacular architecture, where within material culture studies, bitterness and alienation from the discipline run the deepest. While folklorists were not necessarily the earliest pioneers of folk architecture research in the United States, we were central to the coalescence of interdisciplinary research that resulted in the founding of the Vernacular Architecture Forum in 1980. Many of the early members of this group were academically trained folklorists, but as decades passed, many of these individuals, with the notable exception of those of us who teach in folklore programs, began not to identify as folklorists. The VAF has continued to grow and prosper, but folklorists are generally not among the younger scholars joining the organization. Perhaps it's a measure of our success. We changed the values and content of architectural history and historic preservation to the extent they no longer need our perspective. But it's a loss to our discipline. The study of architecture did not become an accepted part of folklore in the United States until the 1960s. How, within a few short decades, did so many feel that they were no longer accepted members of our field? While alienation of material culture scholars from folklore generally seems most acute among those who do architectural research, I think we have lost ground in the teaching of material culture in our academic programs. I suspect that in recent decades, material culture research has been more strongly supported within the realm of public folklore. Even there, we find issues with historical research. For good reasons, in arts agencies, folk arts are presented largely within the context of contemporary production and culture. Of course, some public folklore programming takes place in the context of museums and historical societies. It's within the latter that our ambivalence about history becomes apparent. A couple of years ago, I heard the head of a state historical society explain his decision to deaccession the statewide folklife program in these terms. Well, the state folklorist kept telling me that folklife was not about history, so whether it was the real reason or not in an era of budget crisis, not about history gave the institution a rationale to cut the program. A number of years ago, Dori Noyes gave us the metaphor of folklorist wearing the scarlet F. I would like us to return to Hawthorne's alphabetic preference. Even if we embrace the scarlet F for folklore, what label do folklore seem to fear more? A for antiquarian. Writing in the same volume as Noyes, Richard Bauman in the Philology of the Vernacular notes, quote, sectors of folklore that diverge from those he explored as philological. Here I identify most of the concerns that are generally captured under the rubric of folklife: material culture, folk architecture, custom, belief, superstition, festival, and the like. These fields of study derive largely from the antiquarian foundations of folklore in the 17th and 18th century, basically concerned with the ways of life, still vernacular but not textual, of people cast as pre-modern. It would seem that folklife studies, once part of the revolutionary movement that opened our field to new perspectives, has instead become part of the antiquarian past to be shed. I am not suggesting that we proudly display the A of antiquarianism, but rather that we quit fearing the label. Historical studies are not de facto antiquarian. We have confronted our fears of the legacy of nationalism. It's high time we stop worrying that historical work leads us back to the belief that folklore is constantly disappearing. And sometimes we should be concerned about disappearance, especially when our own government has been the cause of the loss. Certainly in the commitment to the people we work with or for, we need to be aware that often people care about their own history, and we need to honor their perception of loss. Much has been written about the anti-modern thrust of folklore studies. Seemingly before the new folkloristics, we privileged the study of rural people and face-to-face communication. And perhaps even in performance-centered folkloristics, as Roger Abrams once suggested, our norms of interaction are still modeled on the friendly discussion best carried out by the fireside. However, we could write an equally engaging history of the ways that folklorists have long sought the subject matter in other venues and through other means of transmission. Noting cultural manifestations that seem curiously similar to the ones that we traditionally study, folklorists have long suggested that perhaps we take a look at this stuff too. In the 1960s, there was much discussion of the question, is there folk in the city? Culminating in 1970 with the special issue of JAF, The Urban Experience and Folk Tradition. Now it seems like a silly question, but urban folklore was still characterized as a frontier in the 1980s. Nevertheless, scholars have been finding folklore in the city for a very long time. William Wells Newell, one of the founders of AFS, observed and recorded children's games in the streets of New York. In the 1930s, individuals like Herbert Halpert and Ben Botkin conducted research on and wrote about urban folklore. In more recent decades, the urban question no longer being so fretted upon, we have turned instead to electronic communication. Non-digital natives such as John Dorst and Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett brought our attention to the vernacularity of electronic lore in the 1990s. And our new century, internet lore is seemingly becoming an industry unto itself. Still, the interaction of traditional face-to-face transmission with mass media has been a source of interest to folklorists since, well, the beginning of mass media. While some scholars and collectors saw radio as the serpent in the garden, others envisioned its potential for marketing, education, or simply studying the interaction of mass media and traditional forms. Early country music was often marketed as folk music, and as many country music scholars know, the genres both shaped forms of music that were transmitted in more traditional forms. Sarah Gertrude Knott, the founder of the National Folk Festival, saw the potential for presenting folk culture on the radio and dreamed in the 1930s of a folk festival of the air. A few years later, Alan Lomax brought regular folklore programming to network radio. Heck, even my mother had her own folk music radio program in the 1940s. Ballad scholar D.K. Wilgus began writing about hillbilly music and the influence of radio as a topic of academic concern in the 1950s. Recently, scholars of radio history have argued that early radio listeners did not passively receive mass media. They actively shaped it, an argument similar to ones that folklorists have made about internet lore. So I have no quarrel with the constant search for new areas to focus our scholarly expertise. It's just that the taunt, this ain't your mama's folklore, seems to lie below the surface of many a treatise on whatever contemporary lore is current, with an implied discrediting of the work of those who choose instead to study quilts or fiddle tunes or fairy tales or folk songs or log houses. Historical material culture studies scholars seem particularly to bear the shame of the label antiquarianism, as if our work can be reduced to many pointless studies of obsolete objects. Spinning wheel studies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Of course, when we're feeling cranky, we might ourselves harbor the suspicion that internet scholarship consists primarily of silly academic treatises on Grumpy Cat. Folklorists are sensitive to the perception of our field as trivial, but that doesn't keep us from dismissing each other's work. And perhaps it's the fear of trivialization that fuels it. What attracted me to the field in the first place was the combination of the intimacy of the size of the field coupled with the potential breadth of what we study. We're too small a discipline to dismiss each other's work. Not only are historical perspectives still crucial to our discipline, but so too is the understanding of our discipline from a historical perspective. It's interesting to note that in the 1980s, when the promise of integrating history and ethnography seemed to blossom, so too did our growing interest in the disciplinary history. When I was a graduate student, there were relatively few published works on the history of American folklore scholarship. A decade later, we had several. Beyond the comprehensive histories of the American discipline of folklore, we also saw the development of historical examinations of the discipline motivated, as they were in many other fields at the time, by the need to critically deconstruct our field. While this was a healthy trend up to a point, as we studied our own disciplinary tribe, we seemed to lose our perspective as ethnographers. As folklorists, we understand that humans are complex, messy beings, and the construction of history involves creating an understandable narrative, even when it means disposing of inconvenient facts. So I think it is time that we start deconstructing our deconstructions. Why were we so intent on seeking out the evil that lurked in the heart of our predecessors, at the same time leaving a few sacred individuals untouched? Why have we chosen to tell certain stories and not others? Among the most important studies that allowed us to examine our applied work was Dave Wisnit's All That Is Native and Fine. Published first in 1983, during my relatively brief career as a public folklorist in the Southern Mountains, the book was a revelation, although I was troubled by some of it, especially its portrayal of the women settlement workers. Recent research underway by folklorist Karen Hudson offers a more nuanced and detailed view of the settlement women that worked in eastern Kentucky and demonstrates that their interaction and understanding of Appalachian culture evolved over time. One detail of her research that shows the growing acceptance of mountain culture concerned the building of a model home at the Pine Mountain Settlement School in 1922. The women running the school became convinced of the desirability of covering the interior walls of the model home with newspapers. One of them wrote to a friend, "If our neighbors find newspapers the cleanest, warmest, cheapest method of treating their walls, why shouldn't we? Why not accept some of the things that experience has taught their parents?" Also troubling, and this is not Dave Wisnit's fault, is that All That Is Native and Fine allowed folklorists to dismiss the early folk festivals. The White Top Festival, which Wisnit studied in detail, was arguably the most anomalous of the first-generation festivals. We have cut off a limb of our family tree, preferring to trace our public folklore ancestry solely to the New Deal folklorist on the government payroll, rather than entrepreneurial individuals such as Bascom Lamore Lunsford and Sarah Gertrude Knott. In researching the life of Knott, the founder of the National Folk Festival, I was astonished by the things that she accomplished. The early festivals in the 30s included exhibits of material culture, committees of public school teachers who organized programming for children, and conferences featuring leading academic folklorists. The festival itself was adamantly multicultural from the outset. Although Knott was generally in tune with the ideals of the New Deal, funding typically came from media sources. Even after spending years with Knott's papers and listening to oral histories with those who knew her, I found her hard to decipher, but her odd combination of willful naivete, stubbornness, and vision made things happen. In the late 1930s, funded by the Washington Post, she featured African-American performers year after year at Constitution Hall, despite the whites-only clause in the contract of the hall's owner, the Daughters of the American Revolution. For Knott's very first Washington festival, Zora Neale Hurston coordinated several acts based on her Federal Writers Project in Florida. The following year, the DAR famously refused the stage to contralto Marian Anderson, but Knott's festival remained multicultural. Even Knott's small touches of staging diversity were fascinating. One year, she scheduled Henry Ford square dancers back-to-back with a Zionist youth dance troupe. One can only hope that the old anti-Semitic industrialist was in the audience. My favorite story of Knott's audacity or naivety was told with great humor to me by Pete Seeger. During the height of McCarthyism, Knott studiously ignored the blacklisting of her favorite performers and continued to invite Seeger and others to both her national and local festivals. One year, she invited Seeger to a local festival in Louisiana, encouraging him to come early so he could hear Cajun music and informally play with others. On arrival, he was invited out to a party at a home in the country, only to discover, on arriving at the house, that his host was the Congressman Edward Willis, who had grilled him at the House Un-American Activities Committee just weeks earlier. As Seeger recalled, Sarah Gertrude said, "Pete, get your banjo out." So I was leading some singing, and I glanced out at the corner of my eye, and there was Willis, sitting in the corner glowering. And finally he caught my eye and he beckoned with his finger. Alas, this was not one of Knott's successful moves. Folks getting together and playing music could not overcome the politics of McCarthyism. Willis prevailed on the local Chamber of Congress to have Seeger thrown out of the festival. But in Pete's words, Knott and Seeger stayed on good terms ever after. Personally, I find the 1950s a fascinating time in the history of our discipline. We have a growing literature on the folk revival, and we know of Richard Dawson's fight against popularization. Still, there is much more to know about the interaction of the folk revival and the growth of our academic field. Recently, I've been looking at the history of folklore scholarship in the state of Kentucky. In the mid-1950s, the Kentucky Folklore Society had approximately 300 members. 300. Some were, of course, enthusiasts or folk revivalists, but the society was largely run by academics who had a surprising influence in Kentucky's public universities. At Western Kentucky, Gordon Wilson, who had studied in Indiana with Stith Thompson, headed the English department for over 30 years. In 1950, he in turn hired ballad scholar D.K. Wilgus. Further west, at Murray State, the chair of the English department was Herbert Halpert, who was president of the American Folklore Society in 1955. And at the University of Kentucky, William Hugh Jansen held a place of prominence in the English department for decades. Indiana University's Stith Thompson, who held close ties to his home state of Kentucky, was a frequent participant in the Folklore Society meetings that brought together a wide variety of academics, performers, school teachers, and journalists. Unfortunately, the influence of folklorists across the state did not hold. In 1962, Wilgus, writing in the Kentucky Folklore Record, bemoaned the fact that the society's membership had fallen to 185. And he keenly felt the loss of Halpert from Kentucky. He reflected especially on the vulnerability of folklore positions, since they were typically held in non-folklore departments, many of which did not replace departing folklorists with scholars of similar interests. The following year, Wilgus himself departed for UCLA. Luckily, Gordon Wilson still retained enough power at Western Kentucky to make some key appointments, which ultimately led to the creation of our graduate program. From these few tidbits of history, I turn to the future. Unfortunately, more than a half-century later, Wilgus's words still send a shiver down our collective backs. While our membership numbers in AFS have grown, the opportunities to study folklore, particularly material culture, have declined, as have freestanding folklore programs. I don't at all wish to be critical of those who are fought to build and maintain programs within the context of non-folklore departments. Our discipline needs all the program builders we can get, and we should celebrate each and every one of them. However, I believe that these programs can be inherently vulnerable for the exact reasons that Wilgus outlined. And I worry that many of our programs that are now based in English or literature departments, and they offer little training in material culture. As someone who teaches at the master's level, I see that we lose too many of our best and brightest from the discipline because they can't find doctoral programs that support their interest. Even worse, if they're determined to stay in folklore, they feel that they need to shoehorn their interest into narrative or textual models. While this may be in keeping with intellectual trends of recent decades, I think that it ultimately hobbles our understanding of the material world. My intent in reclaiming the vision of folklife studies for the Revolution is not to promote the use of the term or any specific approach of its practitioners. Rather, it is to see our collective discipline as holistic, potentially incorporating historical and ethnographic approaches, and embracing not only verbal, but also, as Don Yoder would have it, the spiritual and material dimensions of human culture. Nor am I here to whine about the lack of respect that we get as folklorists or material culture scholars. Academic folklorists have a veritable Russian nesting doll of complaints. American society does not respect academics. The Academy doesn't respect humanists. Other scholars in the humanities don't respect folklore, and other folklorists don't respect material culture scholars. Let's collectively slap ourselves in the face and say, get over it. Or, in the words of the most famous possum to emerge from the Okefenokee swamp, we have met the enemy and he is us. I think we worry excessively that one, people don't respect us, or two, people think they know what we do and they really don't. On the latter issue, I think this is actually true of most academic disciplines, and in fact, most jobs generally. I may have my preconceptions, but I don't know what it's like to have the life of a concert musician or a postal worker. I think that if people feel that they inherently understand folklore as opposed to, say, quantum physics, it's because local knowledge is what we study. It's a good thing that folklore is perceived as accessible, even if public perceptions are not always accurate. And for every sneer that I have ever heard about our discipline, I've had someone else say to me, wow, if that was something that I'd known you could study, that's what I would have done. A few years ago, a new department head of engineering was hired at my university. She was troubled that people didn't really understand what engineers did, and that engineers were not very good at explaining it to other people. She went to the graduate dean and asked for and received a graduate assistantship, requesting that it go not to an engineering student, but to a graduate student in folklore. She wanted somebody who could help the department explain who they were and what they did. She's continued to engage our department in a pursuit of helping engineers develop narratives that others can understand. Now, if an engineering professor is able to perceive that folklorists can help explain their occupational culture, then why can't we do a better job of explaining ourselves to others? We need to constantly remind ourselves that we're not only advocates for others, but for our own discipline. Folklorists do field work with compassion and respect. Elaine Lawless, in her presidential speech, gave us another trait to think about: imagination. I heard Wendell Berry talk a few weeks ago, and he lit on the same word, suggesting that the lack of civil discourse in our society today was due in part from a simple failure of imagination. We need to turn our imaginations not only to our personal lives, but to our discipline. It's time we also turn the compassion and respect we give to the people we study or work for inwardly to ourselves. We need to respect the diversity of perspectives and interests within our field, and we need to possess compassion and imagination in understanding our predecessors. Returning finally to our friend Pogo, one of the most famous cartoons ever published. Cartoonist Walt Kelly had used his famous reformulation of Commodore Perry's words much earlier in an essay written during the McCarthy era. But it's the poster and subsequent cartoon commemorating Earth Day, April 1970, for which it is remembered. Earth Day came at the infancy of the crafting of environmental law. The National Environmental Policy Act had been enacted a few months earlier, and it included cultural as well as environmental resources in its language. Subsequent legislation provided further protection, especially in the case of federally funded impact. Today, we have hardly solved our environmental issues, but thank God scientists did not collectively shrink back in horror at the thought of using federal money to protect endangered species. If cultural resources have come solely to mean archaeology or sometimes buildings, we as folklorists are partially to blame. Diane Goldstein, in her presidential speech 2 years ago, outlined the problematic nature of our reasoning in our involvement with applied work. When outsiders start taking interest in our concerns, we fear unintended consequences and sometimes refuse to join the dialogue, subsequently complaining that folklorists were not consulted. Diane was not specifically talking about areas of environmental and preservation law, though I think that's also what happened. There are unintended consequences to what we don't do, as well as what action we take. There are people we could have acted as advocates for and didn't. But, while this is a strong conviction that I hold, I fully understand that not all hold the same point of view, and I need to imagine their point of view. Folklorists share values. That is desirable. We share a code of ethics. That's a fundamental necessity. But we don't need to move in lockstep. We are not well served by ideological litmus tests. We don't have to agree on everything. We need to come together with compassion, respect, and imagination. And we need to understand our differences and respectfully disagree with each other. Thank you. Do I have to answer questions? Thank you all for coming.
That was great. That was so good. I love your questions. I love that whole thing about, not fearing the whole issue of kind of antiquarian interest that sort of formulate a certain way that we look at the world, through the past. I thought there were many, many things you said that were really interesting. Yeah.
Oh. I'm just so glad it's over.
Congratulations, it's over.
Congratulations, you nailed it. That's terrific. check, check. If anybody